In the ages soon after the flood, there was a city nestled into the Nile Delta named Sais. Sais loved Greece, especially the older Athenians, very much, and considered themselves closely aligned in their pursuit of wisdom in the world. Thus, interaction between the scholars of Sais and the philosophers and poets of Athens was frequent and friendly. On a time, Solon journeyed to Sais following the trail of whatever ancient knowledge he could find. He wanted to bring something back to his Achaeans that they had never heard before, something that would give them new insights into the nature of nature and life and death. The familiar sound and smell of the Nile met Solon like some forgotten relative, and the bustling ancient streets teemed with life, lit up in gold by the desert sun. He was greeted warmly and right away made for the temples of the city, where he knew he would find the guardians of the most secretive and powerful knowledge, the high priests. As a show of good faith, Solon began a sort of quid pro quo conversation with the holy men. He reasoned that if he shared the most precious ancient lore he knew with these friends, they might respond in kind by telling him new things that were even older. So Solon talked about the farthest antiquity his Greeks had access to, about the first man, Pharaonius, the deluge in ages past and the single family that survived it and refounded the world after cataclysm. He spoke of the celestial experiments of the gods, their fighting and failing and triumph, which sowed great destruction on the earth for many years. At the end of his speech, Solon was sure that he had, somewhere in his pile of history, impressed the Egyptian priests. But to his dismay, the high priests responded to his stories with a chuckle and a waving of the hand, lovingly telling Solon that for all the wisdom of the Greeks, they cannot come close to excelling the Egyptians in matters of lore. With the playful but nonetheless completely honest voice of a father to a son, the aged priest told Solon that he could recall the time before the Great Deluge, before the refounding of the earth by the gods, but also after the time of the first men. He could offer Solon real knowledge about the intervening time that seemed so lost to the Greeks. And not only that, he informed the poet that those times bore great significance for his own people and how they became the Athens that Solon loved. The priest said that before the floodwaters came, long before in fact, the Egyptian goddess Neith, the same goddess that the Greeks called Athena, founded Solon's beloved Athens. She sprung the city from the ground that she felt could most confidently produce men most like unto herself, men proficient in war and in the highest wisdom. She dealt kindly with the infant city, giving its citizens weapons and clothes, and words and writing and books. She taught the city excellent laws and customs that saved them from the driveling mountain shepherds which surrounded them on all sides. They were a cut above the world, in a world that it is said made greater and mightier men. The priest said that innumerable acts of greatness could be recounted by the antediluvian Athenians from those days, but that one act surpassed all others by orders of magnitude. In those days, the world looked very different. The expanse of desert and liquid blue that bifurcated the world was smaller then, hardly an expanse at all. What became the Atlantic Ocean was more akin to an inland sea, and as such was navigable to the deep ancients. In the midmost of this sea there sat a harbor containing a massive island just off the pillars of Heracles. This island was called Atlantis, and it was something to behold. Larger than Libya and Asia put together, it was the gateway to the western parts of the world, and sat as a port of entry to a vast continent that lay to its east. Before the founding of Athens by Pallas Athena, perhaps before the bold prophecy of Enoch to the fallen world, the gods who had fallen to the earth set about the work of dividing its regions among themselves. Poseidon, the second in rank among the gods, inferior to his brother Zeus only in being born later, and therefore in being slightly weaker, was given this fertile and nurturing isle within the sea. As he wandered on its shores and even into the center of its reaches, surveying his domain with godlike ambition, he found one of the first families of the earth tucked into the Atlas Mountains. Evenor, one of the primeval men, and his wife Leucippe, had begotten one of the firstborn children of humankind, a daughter named Cleito. Pleased with the fertility displayed by this family on this piece of the earth that was his, Poseidon noticed the womanly poise of Cleito, already a maiden at their first meeting, and took her to wife once her parents had died. He built her a land protected from all the wicked wiles of other men. He took her from the Atlas range she had known and built her in Eden in the valley beneath it. He worked the tectonic plates of the world like a woodworker turning a spindle on his lathe. From his labors came a beautiful formation, all for the protection and flourishing of Cleito. Around a central column of land, he wrought a boundary ring of water. Beyond this first watery ring, he built up another ring of earth. Concentric after this, like a spiral of water and stone, was a second ring of water. After the water was yet another ring of land, and after Poseidon made a third and final ring of water around this, he was content, and left the remaining mass of land unhindered around this divinely crafted pattern of concentric circles of land and water, land and water. In the central city, he wrought 2 springs for the refreshment of Cleito, one warm and one cold. From the soil, he brought up every plant pleasing to the eye and strengthening to life. Poseidon's great acts of love and protection to his mortal bride yielded the fruit of 5 sets of twin boys, demigod princes of old, that ruled over the great island and ever sought new realms to conquer. Poseidon gave the firstborn of this first pair of twins the seat of the High King over the entire nation. He sat in a palace placed on the center island that was Cleito's city. From thence he reigned, with his brothers serving as princes and lords beneath him. His name was Atlas, and by the time he passed, his power and glory was so renowned among his people that they assumed his own name as their own. Thus, Atlantis was born. As other kings came and went, as the lofty, semi-divine blood of Atlas slowly waned out from his progeny, and the inevitable decline of the antediluvian world, the kingdom as a whole only ever grew in its domain and rule over itself and the surrounding lands. The shadow of rule spread from Cleito's island ring until eventually it even knocked upon the door of the young and budding city of Athens. At the time of their initial eyeing of Athens, even while the lust to own her hills and fields was still only a whisper in the dark, Atlantis was at the zenith of her greatness. The palace had been built into an entire capital city enclosed in walls. The army had earned the reputation for being the most fearsome and well-trained and well-equipped fighting force in the world. The commerce and trade between Atlantis and the rest of the world had ensured her ownership of unending riches, and her population swelled. Elephants from the main island were used as royal palanquins and beasts of burden. Pristine lumber was felled and fashioned with skill into supple dwellings and monuments. The rivers flowing down from the Atlas Mountains fed the fields and watered the livestock, until the smallest citizen of Atlantis would have been seen as a king in the eyes of other royalty. And while all this prosperity seems to come out of nowhere, let us not forget that these people were the descendants of the god Poseidon and his love affair with the lovely Cleito. The gods didn't forget this, and neither did the Atlanteans. They were a devoutly religious people, pious in all their ways and never failing to remember the kindness of their fallen angelic lords. Thus the gods in turn were generous and established Atlantis as the crown jewel of man's dwelling on the earth. And so in the pride that comes from this unnatural blessing, the hunger for Athens to come under the grip of Atlantean rule started to become difficult to ignore. They ruled everything from the Heraclean pillars to the farthest stretch of the Nile, everything from Libya to the beginnings of Asia Minor. Why should they not push a bit further east? Here the Egyptian priest paused and glared intently at his guest Solon, who for his part was completely captivated by the wise old words. It seemed as though the strain of age and hardship from a long life smoothed away in a moment of peace. It was as if, at the memory of what came next, the priest forgot all trouble for the sake of some great memory that every man must have. He continued in saying that it was this great and uncountable power that bore down upon the metaphorical gates of Athens. But in that same moment, the people of Athens grew to be most like the goddess that had founded their city. They shone forth in excellence as they marched to the defense of their home and the resistance of pure, in their eyes, tyranny. All allies had fled them in dismay at the Atlantean force, so that all which remained was the small and resilient force of Grecian forefathers that would prove to be the bravest group of men the world had yet seen. It's said that they fought like demons from the halls of Tartarus, quick like the birds of Nyx and durable like monsters in Gaia's own belly, and the corners of the world buckled under the rage of Athens. Fissures opened, and fire like blood poured up to consume the invading army. Could the gods have really turned against them? Until finally the men of Athens raised their banner over the last battalions of Atlas's sons. But their victory did not end there, for it seems that somehow the gods had forsaken their crown jewel. Perhaps it was the greed, perhaps the tyranny or the cruel slavery her conquered countries were subject to. But whatever reason, the fissures in the earth did not close when the battle had finished. They opened wider and chased away from Athens toward the distant shores of Atlantis. At the palace and seat of Cleitos, merchants who were robed in gold, bickered over farthings, with children sent from their parents to buy some special new thing for their home. The joy that comes from greed gotten away with soaked the place with laughter, while the youths wrestled in the courtyard and the elders argued amicably at the gates. But a panicked hush soon came upon them all. The earth trembled and seemed to fall in upon itself as the mountainous and fertile star of the ancient sea was swallowed in wave and fire, until even the lovely bow that nourished the laboring Cleito was undone by the judgment. Atlantis was swallowed up in a single night, and her capital city of watery rings was never raised from death again. And this, according to Plato, relating the story heard by Solon, was thanks to two things: the faithlessness of the Atlanteans and the courage of the Athenians. So the question is he right? And if so, how right is he? Might we still find Atlantis today? Plato would tell us that we can. After all, he reminds us through the voice of Timaeus regarding the story of Atlantis that every word of it is true. But before anything else, we have to ask the question, where do we even start? How does one begin to trace the historicity of such a grand mystery hidden, if it is even there at all, behind the nearly impenetrable veil of cataclysm that was God's great judgment on the earth? Well, we don't really know, but we do have an idea. What if we start it all by looking at traces of other lost civilizations in the world? What if we see how all these stories start to overlap and paint us a more vivid picture of this epic chapter of time that we have forgotten?
Long ago, a king led his exiled people through the wilds of northern oceans before beaching his ships on the shores of Ireland. It is said that the gods of that land spotted his approach from far off and awaited his arrival with a bubbling stew of both anger and excitement. The king's name, you see, was Balor. He was said to be one from among the race of the ancient giants, a sort of demigod. The gods and men of Ireland had heard of his kind before. They always came from the sea with great ships and machines of war, and an overwhelming size and intellect that spelled certain disaster or subjugation for the people they met on the shores. They had ever fought against the gods that were meant to protect the land, as if they were some sort of lasting vendetta between the two parties. They left carnage in their wake. Everyone knew that they were bound to the sea because a flood had destroyed their former kingdom. The myth goes on to say that once Balor landed and began his reign of terror over the locals, the Irish gods did indeed do battle with him until he was eventually vanquished. But it begs the question, where would the myth of a giant tyrant cursed to wander the sea after the destruction of his kingdom possibly find its origin? Here's the point. A point that takes us, dear listener, all the way back to our very first episode of Haunted Cosmos. Atlantis was real. But as regards its location, the extent of its power, the nature of its founding, and the exact date of its destruction, we'll have to dig deep and try to discern truth from less than truth. Join us now as we embark on our search through time and seemingly alternate worlds for the lost and ancient city of Atlantis. Dude, I think we can agree, Ben. We are so back.
We are so back. And do you want to know why?
Why are we so back?
You just heard it.
We're talking about
Atlantis, baby.
Let's flip and go.
Let's
Atlantis,
go.
a city of lost treasure said to be founded by the god Poseidon.
All men want in the world is a beautiful wife that loves them, children, and the ability to find Atlantis.
3 things. And here's the thing, Ben. We were talking about this before we started, but if you enter into the history and lore of our podcast,
right
here,
which goes deep,
it takes us all the way back years to an ancient time in an ancient city of Orlando.
That's right, Orlando, Florida.
Probably founded by a Nephilim god. And I feel like I personally discovered Atlantis.
You did. We were talking about this.
We were. You picture the scene. We're preparing to record our first episode, trying to figure out what this thing is going to be.
Well, we were trying to figure out how do we close it.
Yeah, how do we close out this high strangeness on the high seas? Probably still my favorite episode, just for nostalgic reasons. And we were like, how do we close this? And I was like, look, I saw this video the other day on YouTube.
No.
Where it was like that day.
Dude, I remember so vividly.
Take us there.
We were like, how do we end it? It's got to be a banger. Hey,
Got to be a banger.
And one of us asked, like, what do you think about Atlantis? And the other was like, of course I believe that Atlantis was real. So we just Googled, like, went to YouTube and typed in proof of Atlantis.
Where is Atlantis? We knew where it was.
Pressed enter.
But I had seen this video of Brightside.
I think, like, subconsciously we knew where it was.
We knew where it was. And it was like, I don't know why it hadn't come to mind, but I was like, we've got to do this Atlantis thing. And this was like, only millions of people had heard it so far.
Right.
So we basically discovered
we gave him, it was a Haunted Cosmos bump.
We gave him the bump.
Right. Because actually, a lot of people have listened to that episode.
It's our most listened to episode.
And so, you know, we can take, I think, all the credit.
Full credit. we're ahead of ourselves, though, because we haven't even... Atlantis.
Atlantis is real, and we know where it is. And I'm going to spoil it. Before we talk about any housekeeping, any of that, it's in Western Africa.
It's in
the Sahara.
Exactly where you'd think a lost sunken land was, in the Sahara Desert.
In the Sahara Desert. In the Sahara Desert, you might say. I actually don't know what desert
Mormons
means.
would.
I think it means like bumblebee, so never mind.
Deseret was like what they called their utopia, right?
Right.
They were like, oh, we've landed in the land of Deseret.
Well, then that actually makes sense.
It does, yeah.
Because Atlantis was supposed to be a deseret. Yeah. At any rate, welcome to this episode of Haunted Cosmos. Kind of bittersweet, if I'm being honest with you.
Yeah.
Because it's the last episode of season 3.
Yeah.
And it's the last episode of Haunted... I'm kidding. It's not the last episode of Haunted Cosmos. But we are going to take a little break. We're going to be taking a break so that we can get ahead for next season.
As we do each season.
Yes, and treat our patrons to earlier main episodes. So the top 2 tiers of patronage, if you sign up, or if you're already one of those patrons, you're going to be getting early access to season 4 far in advance of anybody else. So get stoked.
Yeah, early and ad-free. And you know what? Our patrons also, they're not going to have any gap in Haunted Cosmos, because they're going to be listening each week to the Dusty Tome.
That's right. New episodes of the Dusty Tome still going to be released weekly on Patreon. But what you guys can expect if you're not a patron, which, first of all, what are you doing?
Come on, guys.
But if you're stubborn like me and you're still not a patron, you can expect 8 to 10 weeks of no new main shows. I know sad music is playing.
By the time we come back, though, this studio is going to be finished.
It's going to be lit. All right?
Yep.
So get ready for that. But what you can expect is weekly releases of our Patreon show, The Dusty Tome, that have already happened. And we're going to release them to the public so that y'all can still have that itch of Haunted Cosmos, high strangeness stuff scratched, even while we're not in the midst of the main season.
But you know what, guys? If you do sign up to support the show on Patreon today, the day that this episode releases, we're going to give away one of the coolest. This is just a one-off giveaway because it's super valuable. It's one of the coolest giveaways we've ever done. What is it, Ben?
It's up there with like the granite vases that they found under the pyramids of Egypt, which we're going to talk about in this episode, actually.
Arguably.
Equally as valuable, if not more so. And it is these Dusty Tome books that if you're on YouTube, you've seen us reading from for the recording of the show. And if you're not on YouTube, we've been reading from leather-bound books for the recording of the show. And we're going to give them away. So if you're interested in getting literally all of our show notes from, I think, the episode from this season on Magic on.
Yeah.
We filled it up with, a bunch of shows, all of our notes, all of our scripting stuff. You can look at all the typos. You can read all the weird questions that I write in the margin. And you can enjoy having a little piece of Haunted Cosmos history that only belongs to you.
These will never, there's only 2 of them.
Yep. So if you want that, then sign up for Patreon, and we will pick 2 lucky new signups from the day that this episode drops, and we will happily send you these notebooks.
Yep.
And if you don't care about that at all, well, maybe sign up anyway. I don't know.
Sign up anyway because it's if you like the show. And if you want us to come back with like multiple camera angles and stuff like that,
sign up for Patreon.
Support the show.
But with all that said, let's get into this this topic that's really near and dear to our heart. This is one of our favorite topics. It's
so cool.
Whenever we get a chance, we like to talk about it. And we also like to find other videos that just further reinforce our opinion that Atlantis is this thing called the Rakat structure in the Western Sahara Desert of Africa. And so really what we want to do is talk about some meta stuff like,
Yeah.
could Atlantis have existed? What do we make of Plato's story that we read in the cold open? And then why do we think that it's the Rakat structure? Before getting into some other stories that I think will be interesting to you guys.
Yeah, other stories and aspects of just this idea that the ancient world, whether the antediluvian world, the world before the Noahic flood, and also just the ancient world in general, including some of the places that man has gone after the flood and some of the things he's done, how they really defy some of our natural explanations of things. And, give us great reason to do one of the things that we love to do here on Haunted Cosmos, which is to expose the default setting that most of us booted up with in the world, if you were born recently, of materialism.
Yeah.
This idea that the world is just stuff. And history like this, like we talked about in the last episode, history like this, if you look back at the Iliad and the Odyssey and some of the stories of Greek mythology and legend that we'll continue to unpack here in future episodes as well. We can take those stories and we can strip all of the supernaturality out of them. And we can say, well, obviously there were no gods. Obviously there was no Poseidon. Obviously there was no Athena. Obviously nothing supernatural ever happened. And, it was all just made up. People invented these mythologies around campfires to keep themselves entertained at night and try to answer the great questions of existence. And we say, well, okay, maybe that, or maybe... Actually, definitely not that. Or maybe the mythologies that we have today, though garbled and warped, actually record true stories of the great cosmic war between the powers and principalities and their hatred of God and his image bearers and God himself and his hosts.
And the seed of the woman.
That's right.
And how they interact with man. So... that really gets us into, again, at a meta level,
our theory.
Yeah. What do we think about this thing that Plato tells us? And, it's one of Plato's classic dialogues. In fact, I read in the introduction to one of the translations that it's been Plato's dialogue that gives modern people the most trouble, but it was the most influential of Plato's dialogues in the medieval time.
Interesting.
Which I thought was really fascinating.
That's fascinating.
In like kind of later antiquity and then into the medieval area. I thought that was really, really fascinating.
That is interesting.
But his whole thing is that he says through the voice of Timaeus that every word of this account is true.
It's just history.
Yeah. And kind of the scene is that there's this guy Critias, and he is around a group of friends, including Sophocles and Timaeus and some other people. And he is relating to them a story that he heard from his grandfather, who is also named Critias. And Critias is saying that he was related to Solon, who we know existed. He was a statesman in Athens. He was actually one of the 7 Greek sages that came to them after the flood. So he was sort of this, he rode this line between myth and certain reality.
Mytho-history.
Yeah, and he embodied the, sort of larger than life statesman, the man of Athens himself. And anyway, and so...
was he 9 generations? Is that what it was? Earlier than Timaeus? Or than Critias?
Critias, he was... I think it was 6 generations removed from Critias. Which would have been like 8 generations removed from Plato.
Yeah.
And then the Egyptian priest said that the events he was telling him about, Atlantis, happened 9,000 years
9,000, that's where
before they were talking.
That's right. Okay.
So it would have been 11,500 whatever years before that happened. And we can talk about timeline and how that matches up to our conviction of what the Bible says and all that. But long story short, it was a long time ago, and it was before the quote unquote Great Deluge. Now, what's interesting is that Solon learns from this priest, and his name escapes me, that the Atlantean deluge was the thing that became the Great Deluge. So it started with just Atlantis, and then the gods in their wrath spread it to cover the whole earth.
Interesting.
And so even though it was, initially given just as a punishment to Atlantis, it spread and it became the Great Deluge that sort of restarted the world.
You know what's interesting about that is to see the ways in which we have the true myth, the true story of the world and its history and its making, its unmaking in the flood. which was a decreation
Decreation,
event.
yeah.
So it's unmaking, and then it's remaking with this Noahic Adam figure. He's like another, commissioned by God to go and fill the earth again. It's interesting to see how the gods take credit for what the Lord did.
Right.
They say like, oh, there was this great flood, and it wasn't the judgment of the one true and living God. It was actually this internecine battle between these gods and, fallen deities and demigods. And it started here in Atlantis, and they have their whole origin story for it that is like a counter narrative.
It's funny because
everybody has to explain it, though. That's the interesting
thing.
part.
And then the Babylonians go the other way.
Yeah.
Where the Apkallu say, no, we were trying to stop the high god, from sending the flood. And so Marduk kills him after he sends the flood already. So they're dealing with, they're saying like, well, I couldn't stop him. But after he sent the flood,
I got him.
Marduk kills him, and therefore Marduk is the high god of the Babylonian pantheon.
What's funny is that God actually killed Marduk.
That's right. On the cross, baby. Dude. So metal. Okay, so
anyway,
let's say let's take the bare bones of this story, though.
Yeah.
Let's say that in the antediluvian world, at some point, there was this great, island in the inland sea that would become the Atlantic Ocean once the world was remade, and it was given to Poseidon to rule over by the fallen gods that came into the world. They held their council. Maybe it was actually Azazel. Maybe it was actually Belial. We don't know. Maybe it was none of those people. And Poseidon gets Atlantis. And then he finds a mortal woman. He conceives with her. They have a bunch of children that are mighty men in the earth. And they rule Atlantis. And it becomes this superpower, not only of military strength and governance, although those two things are very important.
Yes.
But also just technology in general.
Yeah.
What do we think about that? Do we think that that's possible at all? Obviously we do, but why do we think that?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two directions that you can go. And it's funny because both of them are going to, like, the materialist account, I don't even think is one of them.
Right, yeah.
Because there is a materialist account of these details that would say, details that would say, and we'll talk more about the Rikat structure and how it's clearly it's just obviously this ancient city of Atlantis is the Rikat structure. There's dozens of data points that
There's
line
even like
up.
documentation in the ancient world that reinforces
And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the materialist view of this is that, okay, we have a real city. Yeah, maybe it was the Rikat structure, and here's all these reasons why. And here's this mythology that developed over time about it. After it was destroyed in a cataclysmic flood that was simply a natural event, tectonic shifting, blah, 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 the Younger Dryas, et cetera, right? So they have this whole narrative. I take that completely off the table. The two that I'm interested in, one of them would be if you take the supernatural view of Genesis 6, where the idea that you had these fallen watcher angelic beings that did mate with human women, and they created this offspring that was hybrid and wicked, and
massive.
They were mighty men. They were men of renown. They were giants. They were like kind of demigod figures, and that those explain a huge amount of history and ancient lore, where you have this gods who are creating demigods. That theme is, ubiquitous in history.
It's Zeus, seducing the mortal woman and having countless demigod children.
This is like not just Greek and Roman. This is Native American. This is Asian. This is
Egyptian.
Norse. This is Egyptian. You find this theme literally throughout the world. So I know some of yours, take the other view. I'll point at the Sethite view and the non-supernatural view of this text. But this is one, I think if you were to put the pros and cons of this view in the for column, the pro column, you would put, wow, huge explanatory power for an enormous amount of the mythology we see across multiple continents and peoples that didn't really have contact with each other post dispersion.
Especially when you consider, sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead, dude.
But especially when you consider things like how when Egypt and Greece started to commune more and more, they realized that it was assumed. Yeah. We worship the same gods.
Yeah, they actually just said, oh, you call him that, I call it this.
You call her Neith, we call her Athena.
They didn't even
Of course they're the same.
It's actually a really interesting point. This happens over and over and over again. Back to the point that these weren't just made up. these were real figures somehow. So you can take this supernatural view of Genesis 6, and that's more of the, what I would call, some people called, what is it? X-Files like view, the X-Files view.
Yeah, the Silmarillion view.
And then people who, either point to a common source for Enoch or quotes from Enoch, Jude, First Peter, and say, okay, the New Testament era authors seem to put some stock in these ideas. This was the ubiquitous idea. On the other side, and in that view, I think obviously you would look at this story of Atlantis and Poseidon being the demigod offspring of the gods and all this stuff, and you go, oh, that's just what the Bible's talking about here.
Right.
Now, the other view, though, and this is where I want to throw a bone to the Sethite people, because I know that there are a lot of Sethite people out
which,
there.
by the way, is a great view to have. It's
perfectly
Genesis 6.
We've made fun of it in the past.
But but that's because,
we just like making fun of it.
It's like making fun of Brian.
Which is hard to do.
Because I know, because he's so
very difficult.
Unbelievably handsome.
It's just difficult. I mean,
intelligent.
I needed that.
Flipping, like, well-spoken.
I needed that. It's late afternoon. Like, I needed that. So before people, though, throw out all of that just because they might take a non-supernatural view of Genesis 6 and say the sons of God are the sons of Seth, and it's about unrighteous intermarrying, which is a definite theme in Genesis and the Pentateuch, and really
the whole Bible.
Just the whole Bible, right? That view doesn't mean that you have to throw out this whole idea and side with the materialists and say, oh yeah, all of this ancient mytho history is that. It's just made up. You can still basically say, well, there were real supernatural beings that people called gods.
Yes.
You take out the demigod thing, and maybe you just say, well, there's demons and fallen angels that are deceiving people. And it really, I think, comes to a very similar view. There's a lot of overlap where you can still look at these ancient mytho-historical stories and say they're better explained by supernatural intrusion of fallen and malevolent beings seeking the worship of man, the subjugation of man, and making war with the seed of the woman, and also just generally the image of God and God on his throne, in general. You can take that view too, and still look at this story and say, oh yeah, when people were doing they were all doing what was right in their own eyes in the days of Noah, and also people were still sinful after the days of Noah, obviously. And so God judged the world, but part of what was going on in that wicked time, really through the whole entire Old Testament period before the cross, was that the nations were under the sway of the serpent.
Yes.
They were under the sway of the serpent and his hosts. We see this in the book of Daniel. We see this in lots of places in the Old Testament. There were demons. Whatever the point is, that I don't want people to be alienated just because they don't take the supernatural view of Genesis 6 and think that they should therefore throw out everything we're saying about all this. And
we don't want them to do that, because the one thing, Sethite or not, whether you take our view or you take the Sethite view, what nobody is saying is that, oh, well, demonic activity just didn't manifest itself in the physical world. That would be actually just to completely contradict things that the Bible says. So no one is saying that. And so, yeah, just to your point, if you disagree with us on Genesis 6, that's great. But also recognize that doesn't then rule out the general explanation that we're giving.
Yes.
Which is that these fallen powers and principalities, with Ephesians 6, we wrestle against powers and principalities in the heavenly places. Hopefully we're not wrestling against God as Christians. So that would imply that there are powers and principalities that are less than savory, I'll say. And they had real, for whatever reason, real authority or power given to them in God's eternal decree to exercise authority over the nations, to deceive the nations. And Christ is the one that sets us free from that, where we don't have to be deceived as the nations anymore, because he has come and he's put them all in bondage. So that then opens the door for a lot of ancient, antediluvian and post-diluvian, ancient pre-Christ deception of the nations that is propagated by fallen, deities, quote unquote, fallen angelic powers that are over the world. Whether or not they copulated with women is a whole other issue. We think they did. So I would say, I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility to hold the view that Poseidon was one of the fallen angels who had intercourse with Cleito, a mortal woman, and produced these 10 sons who were all Nephilim sons. And Atlas was the greatest one. In fact, and this is a nice little segue into Rakat structure stuff. If we look at the name Atlas and we kind of trace its prominence in history, one quickly finds that on the northern coast of Africa, there's the Atlas Mountains. The Atlas Mountains are named after the first king, the mythical king, by the way, of Mauritania. Who was named Atlas, which is where the Rakat structure is.
In the Saharan desert.
Which is where Atlantis was.
Yeah, that's
baby.
Right. So let's get into this. We mentioned it, and the reason we wanted to revisit this is because in that first episode, we were still developing some of these ideas. We hadn't fleshed them out fully. We've laid a lot more foundation work and now have time to go, let's dive deep on this concept, tell the full backstory like we just did from the mytho-history in the cold open. The Rakat structure is this very strange geological, potentially there's debate, either man-made or geological structure.
Yeah.
That if you look at it from above, you would be tempted to say this was crafted by some intelligence.
Right. Or you'd say that's photoshopped and not real.
Yeah, you'd say that
it's genuinely crazy.
It looks like a small, like an island. It's about 23 kilometers in diameter. Is that right?
Yes.
And it has an island in the middle and then depression that if you filled it up with water to a certain level, it would be like island, water, ring of land, another ring of water, another ring of land.
Water, and then just the rest of Africa.
The rest of Africa flowing down now fairly distantly from the coast, but in another period of time, likely much closer to the coast, actually on the coast or flowing into the ocean.
Right. And there's some other geographical features that kind of betray this as really the best option for the city of Atlantis that everyone knows, and it's the ringed islands and stuff. Really, Atlantis was huge, but that capital city is the thing that everyone recognized.
The capital city of Atlantis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Things like there being an outlet that goes towards the sea at the southern end of the city. That's there.
Just as described in the ancient documents.
Right. And there's salt deposits, and, geologists agree that clearly water used to be here.
Right.
There's cliffs to the north, and then the mountains, the Atlas Mountains the north, that line up perfectly with what Plato's talking about.
Rivers flowing down from the north into the city.
Yes. So the Sahara, we know the Sahara, and again, I would argue in the antediluvian world, maybe even a little bit after, was not just this like sea of sand, but it actually had rivers flowing through it. In fact, one of the really fascinating things that I didn't know until I was researching for this show.
Yeah.
Because the problem I always had with the Rakat structure was, but it's attached to Africa, and Atlantis was supposed to be an island.
Right, yeah.
Like in the Atlantic Ocean, which who knows how big the Atlantic Ocean was before the flood, if it even was at all.
Yeah.
And it was, around outside the Pillars of Heracles, the Strait of Gibraltar. Well, the tip of Africa, the western tip, it sits in front of the Strait of Gibraltar, so we got that going for it. But it's attached to Africa, so there's a problem. Well, it turns out that the way that the geology has worked through the Sahara is scientists are confident that it used to be split up by different, they looked like rivers, but they were tributaries between the southern Atlantic Ocean and the northern Atlantic Ocean that essentially cut the western tip of Africa off of the rest of the continent. Which would literally be perfect to match Plato's description of Atlantis. Not to mention the fact that the rings match the sizes exactly.
Yep.
I mean, within like 0.1%.
Yeah.
He gives like 50 stadia or 500 stadia or something like that. And that corresponds more or less to 14 point some miles.
Yeah.
And it lines up perfectly. It's, relatively perfectly circular.
Yep.
It's very impressive the way that it all lines up. Plato mentions elephants being there.
Geothermal activity with springs and
Poseidon
warm
made
water
2
springs. We have in the region in general, it was said to be a region that was rich in different metals and minerals.
Yeah.
And if you look at the historical record, again, these aren't mythical historical records that are related to Atlantis.
This one was written in 1851.
Yeah, these are just normal historical records that you would find for Mauritania in this region. You find that not only was there vast quantities of gold and other metals, but that probably the richest man who's ever lived in the history of known man was one of the kings in Mauritania.
Yes.
Because of the gold deposits that they had there.
Mansa Musa was his name, and his kingdom was right around like the middle of Africa, the African belt, you know, and it included the southern portion of Mauritania where like the bulk of the world's gold came from until America was discovered.
To this day, a huge amount of the gold supply that has been found in history came from that region.
Yeah, and so there's this record from 1851, and it's just like a commercial record. It's not trying to be fantastical or anything. And it notes that before the New World was discovered, some supermajority percentage of Europe's gold was imported from Mauritania. Not Western Sahara, Mauritania specifically, which is really compelling. So we have the elephants, we have the minerals, we have the gold.
We have rocks.
Yeah, the rocks that Plato says were painted red, white, and black. And so it's a mixture of sandstone and basalt that gives you this red, black, and white kind of discoloration depending on how much salt content has been there, how much wind erosion, things like this.
You see that in the region.
You have the two springs in the central island of the capital city of Atlantis. One of them gives fresh, cold water. The other one gives warm water because the Ricat structure is a geothermal active place.
Yeah.
So all of these things come together, and there are other things too, but those are really the big ones.
Oh, the ancient maps. There are old maps that outline this region of, they call it various versions of Atlantis or Atlas, like Atlantean sort of names that you can easily look and go, oh, that's just flipping Atlantis.
Right. It was the Roman cartographer from, I remember the year, but I don't remember his name, but it was AD 43. So it was 2,000 years ago. And he was charting the Roman Empire at the time. And it included, you know, the northern half of Africa. And so he has this little label down there on the western tip of the Sahara, about midway down, and it says Atlantia. It just says it.
Atlantia.
Like, that's crazy to me.
If you look at the cataclysm that affected this area and some of the evidence of cataclysm, you find that there was a huge continent, like basically like all of this material that came off of the continent down and now in the ocean. And it's this huge field. It's like 300 miles wide, 200. Like, it's wider than Florida. Yeah, at its widest point, the peninsula of Florida, and it's deep and wide. And I bet, and if we get enough patrons, maybe we will fund some core drilling. Because I want to drop some core drills down into that thing, and I bet you come up with Atlantean artifacts.
I bet you come up with bones from a Nephilim.
100%. Giant bones and Atlantean artifacts. Yeah. Because it would all came, you can picture, and you can even look at the satellite imagery and just see that there was an enormous amount of water that came off of this continent that swept across it, and either in the deluge or in the later as it dried up and the water rolled back as it rose and different tectonic activity happened. You can just see the cataclysmic flooding and evidence of cataclysmic flooding.
You can look at, and you don't have to be a geologist to do this. You can go to Google
Which
Earth,
we are.
Which of course we are.
Because we've watched several YouTube videos.
But I also have degrees. I have PhDs, countless universities.
We're literally just lying.
But you can find the Ricat structure, and then you can zoom out and clearly see between the Ricat structure and the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, these striation marks that, again, you don't have to be a geologist to be like, that used to be water.
Yeah. Oh, look.
That's caused by water. It's not wind erosion. They've done those tests. It's not that. It is water erosion. And to further kind of bolster that point I made earlier about how Atlantis or the western half of the Sahara used to be cut off from the eastern half, it's easy to just say that and kind of move on like, oh yeah, that's true. But to show my work a little bit, they have done academic studies that quote unquote prove with a reasonable amount of confidence that there's a trace of old water lanes that go through the lowest altitude regions of the Sahara Desert.
Wow.
Right. And so they trace salt deposits, and they're like, that used to be from the ocean, because that, the salt isn't just there. It was set there by something.
Yeah.
It has to be from
the
water.
ocean is salty.
Yeah. I don't know if you know this. and it goes right beside Atlantis. And it says that, of course, the capital city was fed by a river in Plato's dialogue, but it also passes through this volcanic region of northern Sahara. And I thought this was really fascinating. There's the biggest volcano in the Sahara is kind of between the Rakat structure and Egypt. And I know that's a big area, but I don't really know the names that well. So that's what we're going to go with.
We're Americans.
Yes, we're U.S. Americans. And they know that the last time it ever erupted was before the supposed time of Atlantis's downfall. And then after its eruption, because it hasn't erupted since then, it's the last time it's erupted, there's now ocean salt deposits up in the bowl. What do you call the bowl? The dome? The core? What do you call the thing? The top of a volcano.
The cone?
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
The top of the volcano. So anyway, just as further proof that there used to be water there from something.
Yeah.
And whether it's the Great Deluge, whether it was, sort of the piece of ocean that sliced Africa in half, or whatever it was, the point is, it lends credibility to what Plato is saying.
Yes.
And so it's great that we can latch onto this mystery. It's really fascinating, and actually realize that even the most fantastical elements of it could have very real roots in truth.
Yes.
But one of the things that Atlantis is known most for,
yeah, this is one of my favorite aspects of the legend.
Is I was going to say technology.
Yeah, that's
okay.
and is ancient technology, because so one of the themes that you see, again, we've mentioned at the beginning, after the cold open, that you have these themes that run through history that the materialists want you to just say all of it's made up, it's all fantastical, the campfire stories, wives' tales, things like that. And we would say, well, what if it's actually garbled and warped history?
Yeah.
And one of these themes is that along with this concept of semi-malevolent, sometimes benevolent, but tricksy and not quite for you at all the time, and sometimes actively against you, beings, supernatural beings, would give technology.
Yes, the gift of technology.
They bring knowledge, and they would bring sort of like the way that even evil kings will distribute gifts to those who serve them and crush their enemies, kind of things. You can see how in these empires, you always had kings and priests and priestesses who were in league with the evil powers and received blessing from them.
Yes.
Now, their blessing always turns out to be destructive and death in the end. But one of those blessings that, again, runs through many, many strands of history and mytho-history is technology.
Yeah. Yeah, you see it in the Egyptian cosmetics. They say that they got their love for cosmetics from the gods, and the gods taught them how to make makeup. You see the Babylonians with weapons, the Aztecs, the Aztecs in Peru with building their Viracocha monuments up in Lake Titicaca, and they had to fly the stones thousands of feet in the air with the use of a golden trumpet. There's all these like secret technology advancements that happened in the antediluvian world, supposedly.
Yeah.
So the question is, are any of those grounded in truth?
And again, you always have like people who will say, well, no, there was this guy that he showed how this stone could be rolled. And I've seen some of those things. And I even saw a video the other day of a guy who's like rolling large stones with gears and machinery and things like that. But what we're talking about in some of these we're going to talk about this in Megalith episode at some point. In some cases, we're talking about stones that are so large that they're difficult to comprehend how heavy they are.
Yeah.
That are quarried from places thousands of feet below and hundreds of miles away from where they land. And not only that, but sometimes even technologies that we have discovered that you would think there's no way this could exist.
Exactly.
And I think that takes us into this first story,
where I'm going to tell you the story of the Denisova cave bracelet. It's said that if you tell a lie enough, you'll eventually start to believe it. One of the cases that prove that point is that of the supposed age of the Earth that's promoted by secular and even some professing Christian academics. They go on and on about how the universe, with its some 14 billion years of history, has only had the Earth within her for about a third of that time. What's more, they say that man, as he is today, has only existed for 300,000 years, and that man has really only acted like a man for a brief fraction of those 300,000 years. Before that was death and trial and purposeless wandering through the waves of gravity for no particular reason whatsoever, and after that has only come more of the same, meaningless death and struggle. Perhaps the secular atheists would tip their hat to the notion of it being better if man had never been born. At any rate, this is the story we're told by our so-called intelligent elites. And beneath this overarching narrative of despair, they still try to organize man's past into neat little categories that they can study in greater detail. One wonders why they waste their time with this. And one of these categories is called anthropology, the study of mankind. For the longest time, this category boldly claimed that man has been a basic dullard for most of his life. Sure, he used a stone chisel here and some animal skin for clothing there, but for the most part, he was a fairly dumb beast. Only in more recent epochs, they say, did man start to gain a super intelligence that really set him apart from the animal kingdom. But even as they say this, those same people have found some stuff during their digging around that seems to completely contradict their confidence. All of it makes one wonder just how technologically advanced the antediluvian ancients could have been. For example, during an excavation in the Denisova cave of Siberia in 2008, researchers carefully lifted a beautiful, green, jade-like bracelet out of the dirt they were studying. They had only just figured out that people used to live in that cave, people that they said were alive about 40,000 years ago. So they weren't exactly expecting to find something so jarring so soon, but find something they did. The item itself looks to the untrained eye to be the remains of a stained, green glass bracelet broken in half like a crescent moon. On its own, this would be an exciting discovery. Only the richest of nobility in the deeply ancient world could have afforded to have this delicate piece of jewelry so painstakingly crafted. But as they looked closer, a feature of the bracelet, one that is an original feature of the original bracelet, started to stick out to them. Along the line of fractured stone that marks where the thing broke, there was a small hole. Initially, researchers were split on what the hole could be. Was it a product of the breaking, or was it a rudimentary borehole into the bracelet for some utility and fashion? To settle the matter, they had the hole analyzed by laser scanners that would be able to tell them what had done this thing to their special item. The results were nothing short of shocking. The hole was found to be bored arrow straight, with precision that rivals our best modern-day CNCs and lathes. The sides were smoothed to near perfection, a smoothness that very nearly exceeds any of our modern capabilities. The conclusion was forced upon them. Some 40,000-year-old supposed caveman had used a fixed and rotating drill with a hardened but ductile bit to push his way gently into this bracelet and form a tiny but virtually perfect hole in its side without breaking the bracelet in the process. This is not supposed to have been possible back then, and yet here we are. It makes one wonder, what other pieces of ancient technology call the whole secular timeline into question, and what conclusions can we draw from them?
In the fall of the year 1900, a small team of Greek divers were forced to anchor their boat just off the shore of Antikythera Island. They had been diving for sponges around the coasts between Algiers and Tripoli, where old Carthage used to reign supreme over against Roman growth. But on their way home to Greece, a terrible storm had struck the southeastern corner of the Mediterranean. It threatened to push them back where they had just come, and so they sought rest on the small Attican isle that was so close to their final port of call. Unfortunately for them, the storm proved to be more resilient than expected, and they were stuck there for multiple days. Running out of food, and also in a desperate attempt to break the monotony of anchored boat life, some of the divers decided to search for clams close to their boat. They strapped on their flippers and goggles in the wind and rain and enjoyed the long-awaited silence that greeted them once they had dunked themselves beneath the waves. With a solid breath, one man drifted deeper into the cloudy world of blue. He could see the sea's floor about 20 more meters beneath him and knew he could reach it with plenty of energy left to gather a net full of hardy clams. He did just that. Indeed, he did it a couple of times. He had missed the calm undulation that gently tosses one here and there underwater when a storm rages on the surface. In a way, he almost felt warmer and more at home there, especially when the air outside was so angry and uninviting. He dove again and this time drifted a bit further from where he had been before. It was new. The clouded sky let very little light accompany him, and he strained to adjust his eyes to the shadow. But when he finally did, he was met with a sight that shocked him almost into a blind fear. A bronze statue of some old hero, or maybe even a god, was standing in front of him, tipped over to leaning against what he thought was a crevice in the rock. But he pushed back a little bit and realized his error. This was no rock formation. This was a shipwreck. It was a shipwreck old enough to look more like stone than wood, very old indeed. He ripped a loose arm free of the bronze statue and surfaced to his friends again. Thus began the saga of something we now call the Antikythera mechanism. When the storm finally subsided and the sponge divers were able to return home, they immediately notified the Athenian magistrates of the shipwreck they had discovered. Research teams were dispatched right away, and a months-long attempt at salvaging everything they could from the wreckage proved very fruitful, though it did cost the life of one diver and the use of 2 other divers' legs. On one of the final dives, as the brave man climbed into his canvas suit and felt the weight of the copper helmet pressed down on his shoulders, a sense of almost mundane routine filled the air. Of course, everyone still acknowledged how radical it was to be diving for lost ancient treasure at a newly found shipwreck, but the latent attitude inside of them, after months of these same dives day after day, was that of more apathy. And so the diver descended into the depths with a sort of mundane carelessness, as if he was walking down the stairs of his home. The underlying familiarity manifested itself in a glazing over the eyes and a need for the diver to really focus on finding the next thing he should take back for further study. But suddenly, the apathy melted away in an instant. As a beam of sunlight crested a wave far above him and shot itself deep into the wreckage, a glimmer of shining reflection caught the diver and captivated him to the quick. He reached into the little enclave of coral and sand that shrouded the shining thing and gently eased it free of its long-forgotten home. He couldn't quite gather his thoughts looking at it in such conditions. It seemed entirely out of place here. Surrounded by bronze statues and rotted oars and terracotta vases with remnants of paint on them, things you'd expect from an old Greek ship, there was this wheel and gear device that looked more akin to cutting-edge boating equipment than some rudimentary tool of antiquity. Subsequent investigation found the face to be covered with over 1,000 small and intricate inscriptions. The prominent hand wheel on the front hides a collection of gears and racks and pinions behind it. It resembles a clock or some automatic astrological navigation system. But the problem was that this was built sometime in the 3rd century BC, more than a millennium before mechanical engineering would find its genesis in the High Middle Ages and early Renaissance of Da Vinci. There was no good reason for any ancient person to have access to such a device, let alone build one. None of it made sense. In the 1950s, Yale historians teamed up with engineers to attempt a recreation of this Antikythera mechanism as it was when it was still usable. They discovered that what they had found was essentially the first known analog computer in the world, capable of computation and calculation via inputs and the turning of wheels to different outputs. In reality, it's far more than that. The Antikythera mechanism is a system of gears that is capable of predicting and calculating precise astronomical patterns and calendar dates up to years in advance. Not only did this require an astonishing ability for mechanical precision, it also required its maker to be acutely familiar with the movement of the stars in and out of their seasons and the corresponding dates on the ancient calendars that matched them. With the simple turn of a hand wheel, the device could trace for its user the path and location of the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn for nearly any given date, up to many years in advance. This all makes modern historians smell fishy and begs the question, Where did this mechanical prowess and astrological know-how come from? Was it Poseidon?
Came from the flipping demons, dude.
Dude.
It came from the fallen watchers.
No,
And if you disagree, you're an idiot. I'm kidding.
no, like, and I know some people are going to think, like, we're not claiming that in any given instance of technology that we found that has been discovered, that there's no possible way that human ingenuity could come up with any of this stuff on its own.
Right.
However, and I want to point back to something we said to frame this, we have so many stories, so many that tie the supernatural history of the world with ancient technology.
Yeah.
And then, lo and behold, we go digging under the stones and rocks and seafloors and all of the places where man goes and pokes his little fingers because God sent him there. And we start finding stuff that has no earthly business being there according to our understanding of the history of technology.
Yeah.
Things that aren't just like, oh, wow, we didn't know that they could make clay with this certain additive that made it stronger at this time in history. Wow, that was 200 years early. But like, wow, they made an analog computer with gears that could predict astrological events 2,300 years ago.
Yeah. That's...
Like, we couldn't do that until the 13th century. The equivalent of that technology, the Antikythera mechanism, we couldn't do that till the 14th century AD.
Yeah.
In Europe, we just know, and so we're to understand that they did that, and then it was lost
for over 1,000 years,
1,500 years. Which,
Yeah.
I mean, those are the kind of things that make me go, I know humans are capable. God made them
Right.
of great feats of engineering, but it does make you wonder: like, were there ancient intelligences, spiritual intelligences that were whispering in man's ear?
Right, exactly. Because there's been two recreations of the world. The first was the flood, a decreation and then a recreation. And the other one was when Christ rose from the grave. And it utterly changed the fundamental structure of how the world works. Because these powers and principalities are no longer given leave to deceive the nations. Christ judges the gods when he himself crushes the head of the serpent.
Binds the strong man.
And so it therefore doesn't really shock me if we say maybe we did lose some technological capability.
Totally.
Like, that's not outside the realm. And it's not because God is capricious and he just doesn't want us to have it, but it's because those false gods died. And the knowledge that they were sharing with us died with them.
Yeah, because think about this. Like, there is it's not a good, like, I'm not endorsing this in its entirety, but the Stephen King novel, The Stand, is about this idea of this like cataclysmic flu virus that the government makes and then it gets out.
Man, it's almost as if that
Crazy.
happened.
He wrote this pre-2020,
Yeah.
just a heads up. Quite a bit pre-2020. And one of the things that is interesting about this world, where it's something like 2 to 3 out of 1,000 people live on Earth,
Yeah.
is how delicate our attachment to our most advanced technology is. Think about that.
What do you mean by that?
If from one generation to another, we think like, oh, every technological advance we've ever made, it just automatically stays with us.
Right.
Absolutely not. You find this in even government programs, technological program. Like, my dad's talked about this with, he's spent a lot of his career working on advanced technology in the Air Force.
Yep.
And he didn't give away anything classified or anything like that, like CIA, don't investigate. But he would just say that there have been instances where someone in the 80s coded or created some dongle for the Minuteman program, an ICBM program. And then they go and they realize, like, we need to make more of these things to keep the Minuteman program growing until we get the next gen up. And they're like, we don't know how he did it.
Yeah.
And they have to like refigure out from the ground up. And it's actually really difficult. And that's just with like one guy who did something. Now imagine if you had some cataclysmic event that wiped out all of humanity. Could, like, for example, dear listener, could you make a smartphone?
Right.
Could you like describe how the power grid works?
Because the thing is, you could be given all the drawings, all of the parts list in the world. It wouldn't matter. You couldn't do it.
In during the Cold War, the Soviets would often, they had a great, like, very effective spy program. In some cases, more effective than the United States. And they would regularly steal technology that they were unable to build.
Did you get this from Tom Clancy?
No, I mean, dude, I would never. No, this. I mean, actually, Tom Clancy is really good at getting his facts right. But no, this is a well-known, like, they would steal, you know, how we built some element of a fighter plane, or how a coating for a nuclear submarine or something. And they would go, you know, Boris, we have a schematic. And they'd be like, can we make it? Oh, no.
We have no infrastructure.
We do not make. Like, and they couldn't figure it out. Because the manufacturing technology, the materials engineering, I mean, you're familiar with a lot of this, that there are intricacies to this.
Yeah.
Even we just assume that we know stuff. Just because we use the electric grid, we assume we know how it works.
Even like engineer to engineer. When I was in the Air Force, with all of our high-level modern documentation, because, you know, the nanny state requires everything to be documented like to the nth degree. Okay. Even with that, I was an engineer, a stress analyst, looking at the report of a stress analyst that lived about 30 years before me. And he was like analyzing how the load flows through this part and the joint in this part and how the fastener takes up the load and it's fine. And me and my superiors and their superiors, we could not for the life of us figure out how did that get through approval, but it works. We couldn't figure it out. This isn't like Elon Musk talking to a monkey. This is engineers talking to each other.
Right.
And it was 30 years. Like, the guy was probably still alive. Still couldn't figure it out.
Yeah.
It didn't matter. So how much more so, like, when the medievals built the cathedrals, maybe they just weren't thinking, like, maybe we should write down how we did this.
Or the pyramids.
Yeah, or the pyramids. Like, maybe that just wasn't in their mind. Maybe that's why it's on our mind, because we wish that they had done it. And within a generation, you can't do it anymore. Like, we couldn't build a cathedral today. It would take and I know that like one's being built in Spain. It would take a monumental effort, generations long. And the skills that are needed, like the actual handcraft skills, are things that we actually don't have.
You'd have to rediscover how to do a lot of things. And the point is that we shouldn't scoff at the idea that antediluvian times, that very ancient times in human history, they had achieved a level of technological advancement that's potentially far above the capabilities we ascribe to them. And we can't just assume, well, if they had those technologies, we would have seen a seamless continuation of them. Therefore, history is this linear line of technological advancement. No. If you had a whole civilization fall into the sea, which is basically the deluge, then you're going to be starting from
ground
zero.
And that's part of the point.
Of
you're actually starting over again.
And then if you add in the potential that you had supernatural intelligences also whispering in the ear of man, in this, like, you know, the Greek story of fire, okay, then that adds a whole new layer of complexity. To some of these things.
Which to me is why you do see some carryover. Like, kind of my like meta history narrative is, you know, there's stuff in the antediluvian world that's all kind of mishmash and I don't understand it. But you had, you know, these false fallen gods interplaying with man, interfacing with man, giving them this knowledge. Sometimes it worked out really well and there was advanced technology and advanced society. Sometimes it didn't, and it led to the immediate destruction instead of the eventual destruction of a people. And then you actually see that carry over after the flood and with the Tower of Babel. And so that, like, the Tower of Babel was an incredible project.
Yeah.
It was spiritual. It was also physical. But even ignoring the spiritual side of it, it was a feat of engineering of the ancient world.
Megalithic engineering.
And so it's really not a surprise that you see all of man gathered around one central location at Babel in defiance of God's command to go forth and fill the earth. And they're building this thing. God destroys it. And then what do you see pop up in the ancient world after that all over? Things that look a lot like what the Tower of Babel would have looked like, which is a ziggurat, a pyramid.
Yeah.
So anyway, we can see how these technologies can be propagated. They can be a little bit twisted, but they can also clearly be lost. But to me, one of the best examples of
I was going to ask you about this.
Just the plausibility of ancient people having access to technology or to skill, that we can't replicate today is the Egyptians.
And Egyptians, that is connected to Atlantis then.
Yes, because
a straight
Egypt,
line.
In the before Atlantis fell, whether that was some cataclysm that wasn't the flood or it was the flood, Egypt was one of the chief exported cities from Atlantis. They ruled over the cities in Egypt, but not with as much of an iron fist. Like Egypt was kind of Atlantis exported off of the island. And so maybe it wouldn't surprise us to find especially advanced ancient technology there.
Or even maybe that they built the Sphinx and then it was deluged and then later recarved. But
yeah, that's the thing.
For a different time. Maybe I don't know.
Post-flood Egypt find the Sphinx? Did the sons of Noah find the Sphinx?
Some of us think they did.
Some of us being me.
And me.
100%. I mean, 100%. Okay, but some other things.
Yeah, some other technological
some of the craziest ancient technology that you'll hear about. So there's these granite obelisks. And Egypt made so many of these obelisks that are, 75 plus feet tall. They're huge pieces of single hewn stone. And Rome would take them to its prominent cities, but they all came from Egypt. The Egyptians were the only ones doing this. There's one that's unfinished. Okay, it's still in the bedrock. And here's how they would do it: they would find a piece of bedrock that they thought looked very nice, and it's all hard granite. And they would carve the obelisk in one piece directly out of it by hand.
It's crazy.
So they kind of scoop around it, and then they pick it up out of there, and eventually, boom, it's there. It's the same way they made the Easter Island heads, actually. They just carved them directly into these stones that were laid down on the island, and then they would eventually just kind of pop them out.
That's such a crazy, that someone would look at this huge piece of granite and think, I'm going to carve an enormous obelisk out of that.
Exactly.
I'm exhausted just thinking about it.
I know, me too. Well, you're going to get more exhausted hearing about how this. So the unfinished obelisk is 1,200 tons. And it's not the biggest obelisk that Egypt was ever making. In fact, it was abandoned. The reason it's unfinished is because at some point in the quarrying process, they cracked it. And so they just left it.
Is 12 how many pounds?
1,200 tons
2.4?
is 2.4 million pounds.
Oh,
2.4 million pounds.
That is almost as heavy as your mom. Dude, cut it out. Dude. Cut it out. I'm just kidding. Dude,
my mom is a beautiful lady.
Woman.
She is a lovely woman.
Dude, I would never.
You should never. Anyway, so 2.4 million pounds. A bunch of ancient Egyptians are just going to pop this thing up.
Yeah.
And then, by the way, they were going to move it hundreds of miles. That's
insane.
Unless this was going to be the only obelisk in Egypt that was going to stay right there.
They just
right,
put next to the hole.
But again, it wasn't the biggest one, so they had done this before. Okay, a research team went down to the area of the unfinished obelisk and more or less right next to it. They wanted to get a good sample of how this would have gone. They tried to make their own. Now, this one was 1,200 pounds. They tried to make one, or 1,200 tons. Mm-hmm. They tried to make one that was 9 tons.
Okay, so
a little bit less,
like a hundredth the size,
like a little baby.
Yeah, like a little baby obelisk.
And they were using the tools that it was believed the ancient Egyptians used to make their obelisks. After about 8 days, they had made no progress. I don't mean they had made less progress than they hoped. They had made none whatsoever. And so they started to be like, all right.
But what if they had a jackhammer, though?
Exactly. What if they had steel tools that were gas powered?
Just cheat.
What if they had, trucks with drills, like full on excavation mode? And so they started bringing in steel tools and heavy machinery. And they moved from about a 1 square area of the granite. They removed a 2 millimeter layer of thickness in 3 hours of constant.
They were doing a great job.
They were wearing out the machines.
At that rate, they would have been done by 2734.
Exactly. And so it just goes to the best machines that we have. An area about this big, it takes us 3 hours to remove 2 millimeters. You can get a tunnel digger, that goes through mountains, and it can't do any better than that. This is some of the hardest bedrock in the world. Another one, and I think this is crazy, the sarcophagi in the Serapeum, which the Serapeum is just one of the lesser known pyramids. And there's all these sarcophagi beneath it. It was a tomb, right? And so,
Dude, say sarcophagi again.
Sarcophagi.
Sarcophagi.
Yes.
Dude, sarcophagi, and I was talking to a guy.
Sarcophagi, I hardly know him.
I hardly, yeah. Anyway, we're dads.
It's this area is a collection of enormous granite coffins beneath the pyramid. They're all granite. They're all from somewhere else too, by the way. And so they transported these things. And they're up to 70 tons each.
70
tons.
So
just these coffins were, tens of times.
What's that, 140,000 pounds?
Or more or less, yeah.
Yeah.
And so just these coffins are almost 7 times bigger than the obelisk that this team was trying to make. And they literally gave up. They couldn't do it. And here's the thing. The tops and then the fittings that the top slides into in the actual body of the coffin is so precisely made that it has no gaps in between. I mean, the thinnest thickness gauge that researchers could find would not fit between the top and the lining inside the sarcophagus. And then they started putting squares to measure the flatness on top of the sarcophagus. It was flat within 0.0002 inches, or for the metric people out there, 0.00508 millimeters.
But you're communist.
Right, but you're a communist, you should repent and become a U.S. American. And so that's flat. I mean, that is as flat as we can make any piece of milled steel today.
Over a quite large surface. Yeah. I mean, if it's 70 tons.
Now, granted, you could have, here's just...
Now, granted,
that's good.
I'm sorry. I'm just like on a stream of disruptive dad jokes. Keep going.
No, this is kind of a word on how orders of error can multiply in engineering. If you have like a 6-inch square and you put it on a surface and it's flat, and then you move the square over to the next 6 inches and it's flat, that doesn't mean that you can say it's perfectly flat.
Right.
And so we don't know exactly like over the whole area how flat it is, but the point is that you can take a square that was going across the width and move it up and down.
Yeah.
And it is flat.
Right.
And then you can turn it and do the same thing widthwise, and it is flat. And then they were taking really precise corner squares, going around the whole corner, going around the the vertical section as well, and it had absolutely no light that was.
They should LiDAR scan it.
They should LiDAR scan it. In fact, maybe they have.
They might have now.
By now, but I couldn't find any studies.
Do they have any idea what technology would have been used to create that level of precision?
No, they seriously don't. That's the thing. They have no idea. There's carvings like the great Ramses statue that's in one of the temple squares. He has his face is carved in such a way that it is, and I mean perfectly symmetrical. They've done overlays of like symmetry circles to see where any variation is. There is no variation from one side to the other, from one ear to the other. And the ear is made with these like deeply carved curves that they're confused as to how, they say that a copper chisel did it. And they're confused as to how a copper chisel could even do that at all, let alone perfectly symmetrical on either side of these repeatable statues that they see lining the temple in Egypt.
It's just so wild.
They talked to one modern marble sculptor, and they sent him the picture of the Ramses statue. They said, this is the tools that we think that they used. And granted, it's just one guy, but he was like, first of all, I couldn't do that. I would have to use better tools than I have at my disposal now. Tools that I'm not willing to spend the money on.
Right.
And they're motorized, and they're, like
to get that level of precision.
And they're like diamond bit, they're all these, and he was like, I'm sorry, there's just no way. There's no way that that's the way that they did it. They have on one obelisk, actually, it's really interesting. So they have carvings that are older, and the older carvings are incredibly deep, arrow straight, precise corners. They also have the curved lines that are really thin. It's like a couple millimeters across. The carving is, but it's about a fingertip deep. It is really, and it curves because it's like a bird's talon, and so it curves in. And those are the really old carvings. The newer carvings that came around at about the height of the Roman Empire are just like scratches from a 4-year-old
comparatively. They're
seriously.
not nearly as good.
No, they're not. Like, you can't even perceive the depth. It just feels like a scratch. But these, like, you can put your finger in them. It's crazy. So the older ones that the Romans, they didn't know how they did it. And they obviously tried and failed.
Yeah.
No one in the ancient world, no one in the
replicate
modern world can replicate it.
Wow.
They found hundreds of granite vases, the vases being perfectly round, and they're also totally symmetrical, and they're turned out of a single piece of granite. They don't even know how that's possible,
Yeah, right.
first of all. How they would have turned a granite bowl back then. But then they looked at the level flatness on the rim of the bowl.
Yeah.
And it was flatter than they could do today with the best technology.
It's just,
and this isn't just a one-off. This is like hundreds of these vases in just one pyramid.
It's just really baffling. I mean, a lot of this
genuinely.
stuff, it's not just like, it's really interesting.
It's puzzling.
But it's interesting because it's so baffling that when you try to come up with answers, it's just opaque. You're like,
exactly.
how do you explain this?
Yeah, I don't get it.
So a lot of the ancient mythical examples of technological advancement, it seems like we actually have good evidence that either A, mankind had achieved through his own ingenuity or whatever, the ability to perform feats of engineering and really not just engineering, but manufacturing.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just schematics. It wasn't Da Vinci's drawings of a flying machine that he couldn't build.
Right.
Like, they executed these things at scale.
And they did it multiple times. It was
Like,
repeatable
over and over.
for them.
It was a huge scale of production. So that to me is just, I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah.
I don't know how they did that. I don't even know exactly like the mechanics of how supernatural help would have worked, because the other thing is, and this is one of the themes I've seen from a lot of some of the ancient technology stuff is really fantastical, and it's kind of like the Ancient Aliens on history level of like speculation. It's really fun, but who knows? To the moving of things with sound.
Oh yeah.
It's not just like, one of the problems is that one of the ways we want to solve these ancient technological problems is by taking our current technologies and basically backdating them and saying, like, what version of how we would do that today did they do that with? When it may be the case that they used types of technology that are lost completely to us, but are completely categorically different.
Yes.
They're not even close to the same method. Like, it's not just that they had a drill bit that could do that. They had some other mechanism for putting a hole, or for leveling something, or for carving an obelisk. And we could make stuff. I could be like, well, they use sound, or I'd be making it up. I don't really know, but that's also a possibility.
To that point, so the unfinished obelisk, since it's unfinished, it's not smoothed out, nothing like that. You can actually see what it would have looked like in the middle of an operation.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And one of the things that they note, and that they cannot explain, they don't know why this is that the way that the carving has worked is that there's these kind of hand size scoops of granite that are they look like they were just swept off the top, kind of, or like swept down the sides and then literally just picked up. And clearly it wasn't that easy, because otherwise they would have just gone through with it,
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been that big of a deal. So there was effort involved, but no one can figure out why it looks that way. When they were halfway done carving some section, why it looks like sort of long undulating wavelengths on the surface of water. And it's like this big kind of scoop just swept down and took away the material.
It's different than what it would look like if a CNC machine today
100%.
were halfway through making it.
Unless it was a CNC machine with this big, big and sort of rounded, bit.
Yeah, but in the material to do that, to granite, would be so advanced compared to copper.
And it would have been it's a bigger bit than we have for anything.
Just can't do that.
We can't do it.
We don't have that.
So we can't even wrap our head around, just to that point again, we can't conceive of why it looks the way it looks, given what we assume they were doing.
It reminds me of if you were to explain to somebody in the 1300s how we have a communication device that I can talk to somebody 10 miles away instantly. And if you said, how do you think we did that? They would come up with something that would extrapolate forward from their existing technology to how that might be possible in their conception.
Right.
Or they would just come up with something that would be functionally magic. Like, well, maybe they could talk through the air.
Right.
Which is what we're literally doing.
Which is what we're doing.
We're sending light waves. We're sending frequencies of electrical energy through the atmosphere to different repeating things and receivers and transceivers. And but they would be likely to try to just basically take an existing technology. Like, you know, if you explain to somebody, we're going to come up with a vehicle that can take you from, 100 miles in 5 minutes or in 10 minutes. They would say, like, how do you get the horse to go that fast? Yeah. And it's like, well,
we would say, well, we figured out something entirely new.
It's totally different. It's disjunctive.
So it's chronological snobbery for us to say, yeah, we would obviously say that to the 13th century peasant, but we wouldn't allow an ancient Egyptian to say that to us.
Yeah, we do the same thing just in the other direction.
Yeah, that's just anachronistic. Like they could have just had something entirely new.
They could have had like the equivalent of Scott Stapp standing over the obelisk. And just the way he sang, it just rose out of the ground. Like with he was 6 feet from the edge of the obelisk. To keep it all. Don't get rid of any of this.
Speaking of keep it all.
Yeah.
I'm going to segue us into some areas of the world that didn't keep it all.
Dude, what a good segue. So, because they were flooded.
Because they were flooded and they ended. So there's this ancient technology side of it.
Yeah.
And then we just want to give some other, mytho-historical/historical examples of how the ancient people thought about disappearing lands and what that was like. So, Brian, can you take us into that?
Ben, I thought you'd never ask. In Critias and Timaeus, Plato's dialogues that tell us about Atlantis, the priest of Sais that tells Solon the whole story of the Athenian victory over the Atlanteans, mentions something very peculiar. He states that part of why the Greeks have such a lack of deep lore knowledge from before the time of the deluge is because, though that final flood was the greatest and most destructive one, it was preceded by multiple lesser floods. Some of these localized floods, the priest says, were cataclysmic disasters that ended many other ancient civilizations. After the war against the Titans, the Olympian gods sat in council and bliss upon their mountain heights. One of the older consorts of Zeus, a goddess named Metis, was in the midst of boasting about her ability to transform into any person, animal, or object in the whole world. She boasted of being able to change the seed in her womb into whatever powerful being she could conceive of, even one more powerful than Father Zeus. Of course, this prophecy and bragging displeased Zeus, insecure as ever. He therefore challenged Metis to transform herself into something as small as a fly. The goddess obliged, and soon her divine form had transposed into a swiftly moving black dot that came complete with an annoying buzz. This, the goddess did not realize, was a cunning plan from Zeus. He reached out and snatched her from the air and ate her, thinking that her being trapped inside of him would keep her from ever producing an offspring that could challenge his authority. Zeus was partly right. Metis did indeed meet her end in the god's belly, but she had already been nourishing a child in her womb when she had become the fly. Once her child escaped the womb upon her mother's death, she grew rapidly, and it gave Zeus a headache beyond comprehension. Finally, at the end of his rope of sanity, his head burst asunder, and his favorite child, the goddess Athena, sprung from his head, fully clothed in battle armor. She jumped onto the heights of Olympus with a mighty shout, a spear in hand, and a sympathetic look back at her regenerating father. Or at least, this is the epic and purely mythological version of Athena's theogony, or birth. But haven't you ever wondered what this may have looked like, if it looked like anything at all, to the farmer plowing his field on the fertile foothills of Ida? Long ago, as long as before Noah or as recent as the time of Moses, we do not know, there was a primeval and mythical king named Ogyges who ruled over the realm of Boeotia. His rule had been known for notable political things like the founding of Thebes, notable personal things like his divine parentage in Poseidon, and also for distinctly religious things in Greece and Egypt, like the genesis of the cult of Athena, or to the Egyptians, the goddess Neith. One day, when Ogyges sat in some grand palace somewhere far removed from the normal person who, though stronger and perhaps older than men today, was nonetheless extremely ordinary. He tilled his crop of land on the coasts of the Aegean one night and lost himself in thoughts of the world. Ideas he had no business interacting with if he was being honest with himself. He thought of his wife, and the cool breeze from the water swept up the slope to remind him of her comfort and warmth. He thought of the hand of his child cradled in his own, so delicate and yet so promising, and how she would one day be the prize of a man who he could consider his own son. He thought of the false gods he worshipped and fell into the despair thereof. How many times had he thought, during a year of bad crop yield, that maybe Artemis was asking him to give his daughter to her through the fire? He knew the stories. He knew they were true, of how the stars had fallen upon the mountain, of how they had given gifts and progeny to the sons and daughters of men, how they had taken some of those daughters for themselves. Indeed, how could he not believe them? His own king, his own Ogyges, was a product of one of these unions between the god of the earthquake Poseidon and some mortal woman he fancied. Mad tyrants, but their gifts are always appealing. The night had descended on him without his realizing. His people would be worrying about him around their humble hearth in Boeotia. He shook the troubling thoughts from his shoulders, picked up his till, breathed a sigh of relief at the salty, dry air and the sound of night birds emerging, and began to walk home. Suddenly, he was blinded by the flashing bolide streaking across the sky. Was it merely a ball of fire from the gods, or was it a new star fallen to the earth to begin his wicked rule? It slipped through the night with rage in its wake. It flew just over the bulk of the Mediterranean and over the home of Scylla and Charybdis. It split violently over the Aegean, and its bulk slammed into the water. Suddenly, the ground began to shake. Was Poseidon hurt by the impact? And a mountain on the horizon started to blow blood from its summit in a dark cloud. Its eruption met the smoky trail of the bolide, and a bolt of lightning flashed brightly between them over and over again like gods at war. Within minutes, the wave of wind, pushed by the heavier wake of water behind it, met the farmer on the hill. He looked back to the west and saw a dark wall charging across the world towards him. In the next instant, he was gone. He and everyone he knew or loved, drowned in the dark wrath of the sea. It was the flood of Ogyges, and it was believed to have come from the birth of Athena. From the splitting open of the sky, which was Zeus's head, came the holy and fiery Athena with a shout, an explosion, and a spear in her hand, a bolt of her father's lightning. So what happens on the earth when the gods experience turmoil? If this story indicates anything, it's that turmoil there begets turmoil of a worse kind here.
In 1722, a Dutch explorer named Jacob Roggeveen stood proudly on the prow of his schooner as it pushed through the waves of the Pacific. The birds called to him, promising him strange tidings just over the horizon line, and dawn stretched her rose-red fingers across the choppy waves in glee while she danced with the sun. Jacob had been sent by his sovereigns far away across the world to find proof of the existence of a land called Terra Australis. It was a landmass that populated some of the oldest maps in the world, but up until Jacob's day, nobody had ever been able to confirm its existence. Suddenly, while he basked in the epic glory of the scene that met him that morning, one of the seamen who had gone aloft to furl a mainsail shouted the news he had been itching for. Land ho! It was Easter morning. Poetic. Thus did Jacob Roggeveen stumble accidentally upon the island of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. And though he knew it was not the place he had been aiming for, it was much too small for that, it was no less thrilling for him to explore the island because of the things that met him once he had stepped foot on its shore. Enormous stone carvings of men, tens of feet high and many tons, he was sure, stood like sentinels in the island's dirt. Jacob was the first modern Westerner to find the famed Maori Easter Island heads. Almost immediately, he thought he knew where they had come from. Of course, he thought that the people of the island had made them, but he was ancient enough to know that their provenance had to extend beyond the immediate hands that had done the carving and moving of these monoliths. Jacob figured that they had come from the memory of greater men, demigods on the earth, that the islanders had immortalized into stone in solemn veneration for what had happened to cause their downfall. Jacob, you see, thought that the natives of Rapa Nui were actually descendants of the refugees from a lost continent called Mu. What else could account for how these incredible statues, massive in scale and masterful in their craftsmanship, could end up peppering the island that we know now is the most isolated place any group of people have ever lived? What taught them to carve? What taught them to commemorate? They had to have been from somewhere else, or so he thought. Deep in the thick forests of central India, sometime in the 1870s, a young British Army colonel named Churchward worked diligently at administrating famine relief efforts for the impoverished locals. Churchward was, of course, a fine man for the job, and he enjoyed the sense of beneficent love he felt between he and the otherwise alien people around him. Over time, they had begun to form a bond that was perilously close to genuine friendship. With all the difficulties of being somewhere new, with the humidity and unpleasantness of the land, and with the sometimes very aggressive wildlife, Churchward found himself more and more at home in India. He was slowly becoming a part of the place, delighting in it for the simple reason that it existed, and it existed for him. One day, as he explored the woods and hacked through the wet and buggy undergrowth and foliage, he noticed what appeared to be a clearing a bit further ahead. He pushed on at a quicker pace, curious as to what could be hiding in the green inferno, until he hacked through the final wall of leaves and nearly fell into the well-kept grounds of an old temple. It was quiet there, almost like the grounds were somehow insulated from the ambient forest noise that surrounded him. And he felt a sense of weighty anxiety fill his heart as he stepped closer and closer to the main temple at the center of the grounds. Inside, he met and became fast, though unexpected, friends with the resident Rishi priest. Noticing for some reason something special in the Englishman, it didn't take long for the high priest to bring Churchward under his tutelage. He taught him the language of Na'akal, the supposed first and evergreen language of the world that men learned from the gods. After Churchward had become proficient at this language, a thing that took an almost strangely short amount of time, the priest took him into the holiest realm of the temple and showed him what he called the prize of the world, 2 sunburnt terracotta tablets covered in intricate etching that was written in the language of Na'akal. Churchward soon learned why the tablets were held in such high esteem. They told the story of man's true creation and the history of history itself. They said that everything began from one central place, a place later foregone by the gods when man had grown too strong to dwell there anymore. It was a land called Mu. Situated with its center near the equator and taking up a vast swath of the modern-day Pacific Ocean, Mu served as a highly advanced antediluvian counterpart to the more western Atlantis. It cradled men like the gods in its green and fertile bosom until its population swelled to almost 100 million people. At that point, by some dark providence of the fickle and self-serving gods, the rocky, molten blood of the belly of Mu boiled and the volcano at the continent's center erupted, killing every inhabitant, or so the ancients thought, and sending the entire country deep into the dark and bleak depths of the ocean. The people of Easter Island, much like the Mu colonies of Persia, Egypt, America, Burma, and Maya, were just lesser remnants of the greater men that had shared so much wonderful knowledge and skill and religion with them. And before we all just write this off as Hindu nonsense, it is worth remembering how closely this story resembles so many other acts of divine destruction that we know happened in the world. Egypt with her 10 plagues, Sodom and Gomorrah with her raining sulfur, Edom with its haunt of jackals, the Tower of Babel with its swift end, and even Tronas with its undocumented sinking into the Mediterranean just off the coast of Alexandria. We are always tempted to think of God alone, the true God, as the one capable of wiping an entire land away from the face of the earth, and of course, at the very bottom of every cause is his ultimate decree. But if false men were really given over to false gods before, why could they not have sent similar, smaller catastrophes to kill their own people? I would like to say, and I will pause for applause.
Okay.
I went a whole episode of Haunted Cosmos about Atlantis, no less, without once referencing J.R.R. Tolkien. But that ends right now.
No, Ben, I knew it was going to happen because
the Akalabeth, baby.
Because you can't be Ben Garrett and talk about islands being swallowed by the sea
and not talk about the star of men, Numenor in the west,
and how they fell from their greatness into moral decay.
That's the thing.
Experience judgment.
Akalabeth is my home.
Well, men of the West.
Yeah,
We're
exactly.
descended. I mean, it's the truth. Not only is mytho history a warped vision of the Earth. Middle Earth is also
Middle Earth is real.
Well,
Now
Tolkien
I'm an Anglo-Protestant.
as am I.
Okay, that means my heritage Anglo is somewhere in the UK, the island of Great Britain. Now, where did the men of Numenor come from? The island of Great Britain.
Yeah, it's true.
So basically, I am descended
Look,
from Elros, the first High King of Numenor.
I haven't done the 23andMe because I don't want the CIA to have more of my DNA. But while I'm descended from Frenchmen, that's close enough. I mean, the English Channel, it's not that far. It's like
Yeah,
60
exactly.
Come on.
You're
Like,
descended from France, like probably the worst, European descent that is possible to have. I'm kidding. Y'all had some real cool guys like Clovis,
we really did.
Charlemagne.
I mean, especially when you understand that the French people descend from basically Germanic peoples,
Right.
The Frankish peoples, who have some of the most baller of scholars and ballers who've ever lived. Horse chopping,
The best name
crusading.
to ever exist in the world came from the Frankish Gauls.
Okay,
And it was a general who fought against Julius Caesar named Vercingetorix.
I knew it was going to be.
It's the coolest
I knew it was
name.
going to be Vercingetorix because Ben is constantly threatening to name his children things like Cinewolf
Or
and
Vercingetorix.
Vercingetorix. And I'm always
Vercingetorix
like,
is
do
the
it.
coolest name of all time.
I encourage it every time. I never tell him not to.
Cinewolf is a cool name. That can't be
Yeah.
denied. Cinewolf
But
was an English king, by the way.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do you think that there was an ancient civilization of 100 million people and that rivaled Atlantis with advanced ancient technology?
Dude, why not?
Why not?
The world's a big place. It's
pretty
even
big.
bigger when you don't have cell phones, but maybe they did.
Good point. Dude, what if they had cell phones? Can you imagine if we're just recapitulating it? Like there was Twitter, there was like, they called it like Mooter or something. I don't know, dude.
They call it moo.
Mooter.
Look, whatever ancient technology they did have,
Yeah.
however advanced it was, one thing that they didn't have, but that they desperately needed, was soaps made without seed oils.
From Indigo Sundry Soap Company.
That's right. Avoid the destruction that came for Atlantis by buying from Indigo Sundries.
Who just launched their new subscription, giving you 10% off permanently on your order of the 10-bar deal, the men's six-pack, or all manner of scented or naturally scented or unscented, seed oil-free, high-quality soap products for all your hygiene needs.
Right now, my favorite product is the men's six-pack. Consider buying it today and realize how straight you can actually become when you don't use seed oils to clean your body.
Imagine.
It's insane. Now,
Dude, anyway.
I have this note in the thing here. I don't know if you've read this.
I was going to point it out. I was going to say Ben literally wrote 3 lines in reaction to those stories. And one of the 3, literally 33.33%, was good opportunity to rope fairies into the discussion.
It is a good
no
opportunity.
explanation.
It is a good opportunity
Do
to
I
rope.
see how? No. But good.
Of course you do.
No,
Of course you do.
Writes good opportunity to rope fairies into the discussion, refuses to elaborate
This is like Paul saying, like, you're covering ladies because of the angels.
because of the angels,
Duh.
refuses to elaborate.
Okay, it's because, remember our episode on fairies earlier this season?
How could I forget?
Exactly. And how we just tossed out the idea, what if there's a category of angelic being,
Your spiritual kind of, yeah.
right, that's sort of like bound geographically to the natural operations of a place.
Right.
Like a river flowing here, a tree,
sure.
a forest growing
Sure.
there, a mountain
Yeah.
looming over the people here,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, and then, what if we say, all right, in the antediluvian world, the fallen angels, maybe they were even of different ranks, were interacting more with men. If you take my view of Genesis 6:4, which I admit is a stretch, okay, if for the Sethite, not for the Bible-believing Christian. I'm kidding. If you just, if you suspend disbelief for a moment and just hear me out and say, okay, I'll grant that was the way that Genesis 6 happened. All right, sure. Now, what we have is the opportunity to have fallen angels like Poseidon, who is always in every culture associated with the sea,
Right.
swallowing up an island that he helped kind of cultivate in the sea.
Is he roaring?
Dude, old Neptune,
Was he swallowing
He's
islands
roaring?
and timbered ships?
he is indeed. I am so annoyed
know.
at that song right now.
Why?
Dude, the heady thin air.
Yeah, dude.
the dangerous peaks.
Yeah.
The mountains are calling, and
The mountains are magnets. I'm the steel, and you are the steel.
The mountains are magnets, and like you young listener, you are the steel. Go and find high strangeness in the world today. I lost my train of thought.
Yeah,
more or less, I was just saying, with Mu, with Atlantis, with even the flood of Ogyges, which, by the way, it was a historical thing. The flood of Ogyges was very real. What if that was, in part, the action of some fairies sending divine judgment?
I just love the look Ben's giving.
It could have been
conspiratorial.
Right. Very sneaky over here. But it could have been.
Now, hang on. Can I just blow your mind here for a second? Can I just blow your mind here?
Dude, it's like that Instagram account. Have you seen that guy?
The fairies.
Jack's heard this already today. That's why he's leaving. And he takes off his glasses. He has another pair of glasses under him.
He makes fun of podcasters. It's so funny.
I swear he listens to this show. And he's making fun of just us.
People are so annoyed right now with our failure to make a point. Because I keep interrupting you.
Here's my point. Whether it's acts of divine justice from the true God using the sort of angelic fairy mechanism to send floods or famine or locusts,
I follow
his
you.
ministering angels, you know, his ministering angels to do his bidding, or it's maybe like a fallen fairy who in caprice is punishing its people. For not worshiping it or something like that.
I just can't stop laughing. Every time you're like, what if God uses fairy mechanism? Like you just use the word fairy mechanism.
Fairy mechanism. Okay. You've always got to consider the possibility of a fairy mechanism. It sounds like an
Artemis Fowl title.
Did
you ever read the book series for like preteens?
No.
Artemis Fowl.
Artemis Fowl?
Yeah, it's
Fowl. F-O-W-L?
Someone's going to get this. Like Animorphs readers probably also get this.
Hey, by the way, I got a tip from our previous episode.
I got that wrong.
Ethan Sen's brother.
Really?
I think it's his brother. He told us that we said something wrong about Animorphs.
We did.
I just want to note that and say, I hear you, but I can't remember the correction.
Tobias became a red-tailed hawk, not a peregrine falcon.
There you go.
That is my bad, and I would like to issue a public apology. No, it's an interesting idea here that the mechanisms of judgment and also because there's the judgment of God and then there's also like people worshiping demons and the demons like harming them. So you can have both. You could have different levels of supernatural beings and ranks who are involved in their own like off the reservation in rebellion against God, harming of mankind, or you could have God judging directly, or you can have God judging through his intermediaries, which he does. When God judges through nature, he's judging through an intermediary. We're just saying that's a possibility.
He does it in Israel all the time. Like he kills the Assyrian army. It's like 100,000 soldiers or whatever. An angel does it. He judges Israel when David has his census with an angel. And so, these intermediary means are certainly a biblical idea. And really all I'm saying, I'm not just saying it to be funny and like to make our haters already more mad at us, but to say that this is worth considering because you live in a fantastic world where genuinely we say this all the time, every time you pull on the thread of the material, the spiritual is being pulled as well. And so when you look at these mytho-histories and we know how laced they are with the supernatural, with the gods, with the pantheons, you should just realize, you should step back and realize like, and maybe that's just the way that it is. Like the flood of Ogyges, when it happened, the Greeks who survived in Boeotia, or if they lived in the surrounding provinces, they saw that and they thought, look, Athena is born. And that's crazy to me. And it's not because they're just idiots, but it's because whether that's true or not, is kind of beside the point that I'm making. But the ancients, they captured something true about the world that we have lost. And that's why I always bring up fairies, because it's the thing that gets the people's attention in this regard. And that is that when things happen in the quote unquote heavens, it often manifests itself with something going on in the world. We see this in Revelation. When the angel in Revelation blows the trumpet, what happens in the world? Some horrible plague is judgment. And now, yes, that's anthropomorphic language. It's analogical knowledge. All that stuff's right. But it's still real language. It's still real knowledge that we're supposed to be able to draw conclusions from about how God deals with the world that he made. So anyway.
So true, King.
I think with that, it's time to conclude the show.
Yeah.
and thus the season.
It's kind of a bittersweet moment.
It is a bittersweet moment, actually. I mean, I'm tempted to hold your hand, but I don't know how you feel about that, and so I'm not going to do it.
Don't do it. Like, I'd say don't. But here's the thing. Don't.
Yeah, but here's the other thing. We're going to kind of end the show with a bit of a, more pastoral exhortation as we explore the question of what's the fundamental error, the fundamental temptation that we all face that lies behind these stories of fallen civilizations. Mm-hmm. And we want to take our stab at poking that fundamental error in the eye and hopefully protecting ourselves and all of you from it as well.
Throughout the Epic of Gilgamesh, we encounter the titular hero suffering over and over again with the question, what is it all for? He is tamed from his tyranny by the friendship of the demigod Enkidu, only to witness the death of his beloved friend shortly thereafter. In the intervening adventures of despair Gilgamesh undertakes in his search for immortality, he encounters things too fantastic for man, things that every man could only dream of seeing, doing, tasting, smelling. In his despair, Gilgamesh lives the most epic life anyone could ever imagine, and yet none of it satisfies him. He bemoans the cruelty of the gods on men and laments the fruitless and endless toil of life. Quote, how long does a building stand before it falls? How long does a contract last? How long will brothers share the inheritance before they quarrel? How long does hatred, for that matter, last? Time after time, the river has risen and flooded. The insect leaves the cocoon to live but a minute. How long is the eye able to look at the sun? From the very beginning, nothing at all has lasted. End quote. David Ferry, The Epic of Gilgamesh. This is the attitude with which Gilgamesh comes at long last back to the entrance of his own city. Destitute and lost, not fit to rule and not even fit to live anymore, the ancient hero looks upon the walls of his kingdom and hope suddenly returns to him. In a moment of unlooked-for reprieve from his sorrow, he finds the insight he had looked for so long. What matters is not the fleeting single life lived. Instead, what matters is the monuments and the legacy left behind. What matters to Gilgamesh is what matters above all else to all of Babylon. Indeed, it was Babylon's gift to Western civilization. The city, the place, civilization itself. And so the epic concludes with the same lines it opened with. Quote, he looked at the walls, awed at the heights his people had achieved, and for a moment, just a moment, all that lay behind him passed from view. Herbert Mason, The Epic of Gilgamesh. To Gilgamesh, the way to escape the unavoidable sorrow of life is to look to the city walls, to see the triumph of man come together, and trust in the hope of those walls growing out and up with generations. We even hear this sentiment echoed in the opening lines to Virgil's Aeneid. The Roman bard could read the times he lived in. He saw the desperate need for tangible hope, for salvation, for a Messiah in the world. And so relates the story of his ancient forefather Aeneas with the beginning, quote, wars and a man I sing, in exile driven on by fate. He was the first to flee the coast of Troy, destined to reach Lavinian shores and Italian soil. Yet many blows he took on land and sea from the gods above, thanks to cruel Juno's relentless rage, and many losses he bore in battle too, before he could found a city. Bring his gods to Latium, source of the Latin race, the Alban lords in the high walls of Rome. End quote. Robert Fagel's The Aeneid. The high walls of Rome. And that is the hope that Virgil leaves us with at the end of the poem, Rome. Roman piety, Roman governance. Can all man's hopes be placed on the machinations of men? What comes of men when they are?
The workers labored long and hard under the driving hand of the burning sun. That core of life and heat and help set in the vast expanse of the heavens tore down its wrath upon them, begging them to try and reach it, and try they did. The floodplain glistened with the mud that shimmers after the raining season. Bitumen and pitch were brought, bricks were cut from the clay and burned, walls were built, walls that meant the hope of man. The workers themselves were men in need of hope, and the work was meant to be their hope. They all knew that countless ranks among them would die before ever seeing the fruit of their labor set in a vision before them by their great leader Nimrod, a tower, a temple built to heaven, whose top was the gateway into heaven itself. They, men thought feeble by the god, could spurn his charge to fill the earth and subdue it. They did not want the earth. They did not want the curse. They would settle for nothing less than heaven. There they would spread, there they would fill, there they would subdue, and they would start by subduing the God who cursed them. And so they stayed close. They fretted not about the forgotten and destroyed places elsewhere on the earth. Everyone would now remain here. Gone were the days of nations abroad, advanced and mighty nations done away with in a single night. This would be the age of men like the gods, the age where man would take his rightful place upon the throne he did not build. But to reach that throne, to attain their unattainable goal, all of their will would have to be turned to this one thing, this one city, this one tower, that held all of their hopes within its ascending pyramid steps. So they dug, they cut, they burned, they pitched, and they built stone upon stone, ever climbing into the weightless air above the plain of Shinar. In the work they sang, and in the songs they found reason to work, and so in the work they found peace and purpose, and a sort of joy that comes from rebellion in numbers, with a youthful certainty of success. But all at once, even while the fires were hot with hardening brick, the God they hated so, the God that had sent the flood so many years before, came from the herald of the stars. The clouds were the dust of his feet. The sky darkened and lightning flashed. The way to heaven was shut. The walls that held their very lives within them were cast down. The women wailed and beat their breast, and the suckling children cried for their mother's attention, but their cries went unnoticed. The men coddled their own hearts in darkness and fear and hatred and shame. Are the gods not just? If only they knew then how lucky they were, that he sometimes checks his justice with mercy. Confusion spread among the ranks until one man in a group of 100 could only hear the familiar voice of one or two others some yards away. One worker could no longer speak to his best friend in the world. His friend may as well be something only slightly better than an animal now. What could man do but separate once the tongues were twisted and tied? If they would not obey for God's glory, then he would force their hand for their own good. The men of Babel had made their God their belly, and their belly craved the glory of the city that ascends to heaven, the city that is undying, wherein all men might dwell in peace, free from the fear of wrath and judgment. But the men of Babel got it all wrong. It was not God who dealt harshly with them. It was they who had brought ruin on themselves. It was not the city of man that ascends up to God that was worthy of all their hope and sweat. It is the city that comes down from heaven, the New Jerusalem, that is worthy of ours. Babylon, Troy, Athens, Sparta, Rome, and yes, even Atlantis could have been untarnished heritages of civilization. In many ways, by God's grace, they still are. But they all ended in darkness and the flame of earth's belly because they were never strong enough, never big enough or good enough or beautiful enough to hold the hope of men within their gates. They fell so far because of how high man had lifted them up in their hearts. Be warned, ye rulers of men. Kiss the Son, lest in his anger you die. Your hope for your city finds its seat in something good, a love for the earthly flourishing of man. But let now your final hope be found there on the last day. Your final hope must be inside the gate of a city made by one greater, a city made by the one who made you. How many Atlantises have there been? How many Babels? Is not every man who sets himself against God one among the old Atlanteans? For where one's hope is, there his heart will be also. Trust not in the things of earth to save you. It has never worked before, and it will never work in the days to come. War and a God-man I sing, a king driven on by will. He was the first to flee the closed door of death, destined to reach the river in the ends of the earth. Many blows he took on land and sea from God above, for you and me, and many tears he felt in sorrow too, before he found the city. Brought God to man by blood from the heel, source of the eternal race, the priest kings and the high walls of Zion.
We'll see you next season.
Indeed.